Okay. Well, welcome everyone. I'm Dean Churchwell, and joining us tonight is Dr. Harrison Smith. And we're going to have a conversation in which we talk about death and dying and grief and loss and those really big feelings that all of us have. All of us have these feelings, and it doesn't matter if we are itty bitty kids or, big, tall adults. None of us escape these. And so we'll talk sort of generically around these topics, and then we'll have time for questions um, and really it's an opportunity for us to be a little bit vulnerable with each other and be able to say, I want to talk to my kid about this, or I've been asked about that. And we're going to let go of tonight any right or wrong answers. And so when you're thinking about asking your questions, don't feel nervous about, maybe not having the right words or knowing the right way to phrase things. And certainly utilize the chat function if writing is more your style, or if there's something that someone says that resonates with you and you want to add into that. And so I'm going to turn it over now to Dr. Smith, to Harrison, and we'll go from there. And if you'll have any questions that you might have off the bat, you can go and put those into our chat section.
Thank you, Katie. I guess, I would start by maybe reiterating something you said about how there really are no right or wrong ways to grieve. And so anything I say should hopefully be taken in that light. But I would also start by saying that one thing we know about grief is that it heals when shared. And so something like this, what we're doing right now, would be one way that people can share. And so I don't want to spend a lot of time talking myself. Would certainly be more open to questions, because grief is so individual. It's while it is universal, obviously, how people experience grief is so incredibly individual. And so I want people tonight to have a chance, with individual issues or concerns, to have a chance to talk about those. But I think that, the notion that it's healed, people do better with grief, cope better with grief when they can share and talk about their experience. It's, a very simple analogy, I think, is the understanding, or the finding, I guess we would say, that you can put people in who have these athletic trainers have found that when somebody has an injury, let's say they've sprained their ankle, and they ask them to put it in a bucket of ice, they can keep that foot in a bucket of ice much longer if they put somebody next to them who puts their foot in a bucket of ice. So that's kind of the notion. That's the physical manifestation of grief healing when it's shared. But the other, I guess, aspect of that is that language, being able to process emotional experience with words, with language, is our greatest asset, I guess, in coping with grief. Obviously, in addition to our faith, but language, is a higher cortical function, and grief is midbrain emotional experience. And that emotional experience can rule us if we don't use language to master and harness those emotions. And language doesn't have to be in oral form. It can be done in written form. And so I think that people writing, using journals, is a great way. Expressing themselves in written form can be a great way. But using oral language with other people, social support, is the best thing people can do. And There are obstacles to that, of course, reasons that people don't want to talk about it. I mean, one obvious obstacle is that other people can get uncomfortable. And sometimes people don't want to create discomfort in others, so they will not talk about things. But really, that's the gold standard, we call it, the ability to talk about, use language to process emotional experience. And there is a profession such as mine because people don't have to worry about other people, my reactions. They don't have to worry that I will be critical or be preachy or withdraw or get distressed myself. But hopefully people can do that with others without having to find a therapist. But unfortunately, that's not always the case. So losses, in families yes, they're emotional, but the emotional brain doesn't forget. And so losses in the present always trigger those emotions that belong to losses in the past. And we've all had them over the course of our lives. We have losses, and losses, I don't just mean somebody dying. Losses are multiple and complex and can involve, losses in more abstract terms, losses of security, um, certainly losses of control, losses of um, faith, even that certainly can happen. The sense of a loss of a future, losses of stability. Losses come in multiple forms, and generally, and I am kind of getting into lecture mode, but the earlier in life people have serious loss, the harder it is for them to cope with later loss. And so that does make loss a very complex kind of experience. And people don't understand that. They can be critical of themselves, of course. And why am I feeling this way so many years after I've had this loss? And that's why it's so individual, because it kind of intersects with that history, with people's history of loss. But then, we are in relationship systems. We are in families, and our losses and the way we deal with them kind of intersect with others in our family and our children or our spouses or our parents, perhaps. And so loss is a family event, and um, families, some families do better and some don't with the issue of loss. Some families kind of have because it's a distressing emotion. Sometimes people will do some of those things I mentioned earlier, like having a distress reaction themselves, or withdrawing, or getting critical, or getting preachy, or the kinds of things that suppress dialogue and that ability to share that loss experience. And so it is a family event. And sometimes that, when I say family, I don't just mean the immediate family. Sometimes it's in fact, not sometimes, it's always a multi-generational issue. How losses have been dealt with in over time. And, families don't always cope with loss well. In fact, seems to me families generally don't cope with loss well. And, the unhealthy forms of coping, are numerous. And, from substance use is unfortunately an all too common way that families will cope with loss, by trying to make those painful feelings go away. And then that, of course, keeps people from being available to each other. And so that grief cannot be shared at that point. And so loss as a family affair is a multi-generational issue. And the triggers for the emotions that belong to loss, are also numerous and can involve things like ours, obviously anniversary dates, but um, for children can involve some very concrete kinds of things, you know, can trigger emotions that belong to grief. And so it's very important as a parent, particularly with young children, to be aware of how your kids are reacting. Um, and those reactions can be distressing. A lot of times kids just act out. A lot of times they will regress, and you can see things like, bedwetting or thumb sucking, depending on the age of the child. But they can act out. They can have difficulty containing their own behavior because dealing with emotional distress is exhausting. And kids, when they get exhausted, as we all know, that's when they start to act out. They don't control their behavior.
Behavior comes out when they're really tired.
Right, when you're really tired. And it's not just with kids, it's with us as adults, with our significant others. That's when we may get more irritable or act out in other ways. And so um, but with kids in particular, that is difficult, because when kids are acting out, it's wearing to a parent, and parents can get angry about the kid acting out, and then that just compounds things. And so it's a very difficult process. And you always hope that parents have a lot of social support in dealing with the grief, the losses that they're facing. And that's where families can be most important. But as I say, sometimes families get distressed themselves and don't like that feeling, and so they will distance. There are, a number of ways people react to so-called negative emotions. It doesn't have to be grief. It could be anger or any other negative emotion. And the three common negative reactions to negative emotion, one is what we call a distress reaction, where you are upset and the other person gets upset too. But another way that parents often will react is a punitive reaction. They'll get angry at the child and tell them to go to their room, um, or withdraw their love and affection, or some other withdrawal of reinforcement. And then the third way that not just parents, but all people will react to negative emotions is what we call a minimizing response. So you'll get, people saying, well, what do you have to feel bad about? Or, it's been so long since such and such happened. Why are you still upset? That's the worst kind of thing people can say, of course, when somebody's grieving, because grief is not a linear process. I guess people would like to think that it's linear, that you kind of slowly emerge out of it. But I think grief is more of a circular process. You kind of go through it, and then you kind of emerge a little bit out of it, but then something triggers and you're back kind of feeling it again. So, and the circle may get bigger so that the times are longer, but it is not linear. And it is amazing to me how 50 years later, and I don't mean to scare anybody, but grief reactions you can see almost a generation or two later. I mean, decades later, when something will trigger emotions that belong to a loss, depending on the nature of the loss. And losses, in addition to being individualized, they're incredibly complex. And so um, I guess I will stop at this point uh, and see if there are any thoughts or questions about some of what I've said.
I know one of the questions that I've received as a priest is, in these church systems that we belong in, we experience sort of losses within our own immediate families, but then we experience loss as a faith family as well. And sort of that's like it's a great thing, and then it's a really hard thing as well. because you never get to escape it, right? There's always a funeral, and you see a casserole as a kid and you go, did someone die? Did someone get married? What's happening here? It's just another casserole. And I think, we're death is one of those things that we don't have really, even in the church, even as faithful people, we get really um, distressed when we talk about things like death and dying. As people who just celebrated the resurrection of Christ, and can very surely believe that that is something for each of us. um, when death happens, we tend to lose our words for it. And I think our kids suffer for that, because they see big feelings, they see big emotions, and then we're not very good at talking about that. And I'm wondering if you could give us, oh, tips or tricks, or how do we talk about death and dying? Do we, I know that we sometimes like to talk about it by not talking about it, but I'm 100% convinced that that doesn't work. So how do we talk to the 6-year-old, the 8-year-old, the 10-year-old about, all right, someone has died and this is what that means? And
Well, I guess I might just mention a resource that could be helpful. Is there's a book called How Do We Tell the Children, that does kind of take different ages and talk about different ways to present or talk about grief and loss. And I think it's a very good book. And um, so that would be a resource that people could look to if they have kind of ongoing questions about how to do that. But another thing you mentioned, Katie, made me think of a comment. George Back, the dean, I guess, how long ago now was that? Dean Back, who was with us for almost 25 years, used to talk about what he called, he kind of put it in the context of a fear of feelings. Then he talked about the Eastery emphasis, that it's kind of this over focus on positive psychology, and what Barbara Ehrenreich, her term is bright sided, that you kind of have this almost emotional pressure to look at the bright side, the focus on, the Eastery side of Christianity, and which is wonderful, but people can start to feel like, they aren't allowed to have those darker feelings. And so it's very important for people to feel like they have, I guess, permission to feel bad. I mean, it sounds kind of crazy to have to say that, but and I think there's a very, we have in our culture, uh, there is a very strong emphasis on positivity. That it's kind of part of our capitalist, salesman orientation. That we have to present a certain positivity to the world. And there is another great book that I would say I would also offer as a resource called Healing Through the Dark Emotions, where that's kind of her theme, is that, people have to be, I guess, have not just permission, but an understanding that those dark emotions are what that help us grow as people, that give us the empathy that we need as human beings to connect with others. And so anyway, I'm starting to ramble now, and I'll stop.
so my approach has always been with sort of everything, with my own kids, with kids that I encounter, in the various churches that I serve, just to be really honest, and say, when they say like, hey, my dad died, to say, yeah, your dad did die. And just to be really honest and not try and cover things up with, euphemisms or, oh, but, insert some sort of platitude, that
That's very important.
kids know when they're
Use
being,
the word death directly and not passed away, or
yeah.
certainly not went to sleep, or that kind of language, because for younger kids, that's very hard for them to understand.
Well, and I think as adults, we know that that's kind of like, I think as, we all have sort of our BS detectors, right? And I think as adults, we like to think that we're really good at detecting when people are placating us. And boy, do kids are even better at it than adults are. They know when they're not being told the truth. They know when they're being catered to. And so I've always felt like one of the best things that we can do for our kids is to, treat them like human beings and honor exactly what it is that they're feeling.
and
Even,
and include them.
yeah.
Not, I mean, sometimes people feel like they don't want to upset the kids, so they won't include them in explaining what happened, or in I think worst cases, they won't allow them to come to a funeral, for
Mm.
example. I think that's a big mistake.
So can you sort of lead us through, if we're talking with a young one, whether it's, our own kids or someone that we're ministering to, if it's a grandchild perhaps who's experiencing some of these big feelings, like in a role play situation, what might that look like? Um,
You mean how the kids might express it?
or perhaps how we might be able to engage with them in a way that is helpful. Um, I'm thinking more like I always found it really helpful when people would get down on my level and talk with me. I like to do that with kids, right? So if I'm talking to a kid, I'm gonna come down onto their level rather than standing up over talking to them. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
ways that we can help to build those connections to have the hard conversations.
Mm-hmm. That's a very good point. I mean, something as fundamental as getting down on their level is a very good thing to do. I think it's important to give them permission to be upset, to recognize that what's going on is very upsetting to them and to you. And um, I think that just acknowledging your own distress kind of gives them permission in its own right to have those feelings themselves. And um,
So it's
yeah,
okay to show our emotions to
absolutely,
children.
absolutely. And not only okay, I think it's important.
Yeah, well, I hear often, I just need to be really strong for the kids. And I think, what do we mean by that? What does that mean to be strong for them? Because I don't think it means not showing emotion.
No, I mean, I guess what I would say is it's important to do everything you can to maintain your own functioning. That's
Yeah.
what strength is in spite of those feelings, you still get up in the morning, or make sure that routines are maintained, and get meals on the table, and just maintaining your own functioning in spite of your distress. And that is really hard to do sometimes.
Yeah. Yeah. Any other questions or anything that's sort of bubbling up for other people who are on our call tonight?
One of the questions I have is how, and this is really more of a spiritual question than is how we deal. And I'm wearing two hats tonight. I'm wearing my diocesan role hat for formation ministry, and then I'm also wearing a hat of being a relatively recent widow with a young child. And so how do we compete with the narrative that we hear in Oklahoma a lot of God has a plan, and this whole like, if we're adults, we give people Sarah Bessey's book, like, or not Sarah Bessey's book, but the book that you all read for Lent at the cathedral, like, yeah. We have narratives to deal with that as adults, but how do we? I've had my 8-year-old daughter now ask about, people said that it was God's plan that my dad died. How do we handle those kinds of questions, which are really part of the faith narrative that we have, particularly in places in Oklahoma? And so how do we help our children deal with those questions?
Yeah. You know, so for me, sometimes I think as Episcopalians, we can be so open-minded, right? And we want to be really curious. And I think if ever there was a time to just be very clear, this would be one of those times. And you would say, that is absolutely not true. And then I think to try and tell them that person's trying to make you feel better. And they mean really well, but that is not true. It was never part of God's plan that, your dad was going to die in this way. Now, as our kids get older, obviously it's a part of a plan somewhere that all of us die, right? Like that's going to happen. But, God is not sitting there going like, okay, first day, sun, moon, and then, day billion, whatever, car accident. That's not true. That's not how God works. Absolutely not. And then I always like to tap um, into some curiosity then with our kids to sort of say, that feels like that might be really mean. If God wanted dad to die, that feels really mean. You think that God is mean? Like let's think about our experiences of God together, right? Like, and then talk about, you know, God was loving at our experience that we had together at camp. God was love when our families came and surrounded us when, dad died. And we've experienced God as being so loving even now as we have like as our family is growing together. And I would give them the language of seeing more expansively that other people's narrative of God does not have to be their narrative of God. And I think it's just, equipping them the way that we would with anything else. This just feels so icky because, when you really think through that statement, like God, this was all part of God's plan, like, then you're like, well, then God sucks. And like God's plan is terrible. You know? And so I think it really is okay for us to say, we don't believe that. That's not true. And to give them concrete examples because they exist everywhere in every single day, concrete examples of how we know that that's not true. And I think, certainly, for Bridget, as she gets older, to be able to say like, these are really complicated questions that people are trying to figure it out, is they're just complicated. And there is no real easy answer about why these things do happen. But our experience in the aftermath has been an abundance of love. And we know that. We've lived it, we've eaten it, like, right? We ate the love when people dropped it off on our doorstep. We smelled the love and the flowers, we, felt the love in all of the hugs, right? I think it is okay to tell our kids, like, no, that's just bad theology. and it's harmful, right? I think it's okay to do that, you know. And if Bridget wanted to go back and tell her friend that is not true, you know, that is not true, well, good for her. God likes feisty women.
And,
Anyone?
or maybe
Like to add?
just, I don't believe that.
Yeah.
So she doesn't get into, yes, it is. No, it's not. I just don't believe that. I don't believe in a God that would do something like that.
Yeah. I think too that we also have permission as adults, as children, to tell people when they're not being helpful to us. And right, so like I'm sure I've been on the receiving end of like well-intentioned but such hurtful compassion, right? Where I'm just like, oh, that was not compassionate. That was actually really hurtful. But I know that you're really well-intentioned, and so you just sort of stand there and you receive it.
Mhm.
I think it would be a really good thing for all of us if we could say, you know, and I don't have the best language here to either sort of say like, I got to go and just, you know, run away, or to say, that's not helpful to me right now. But when I want to talk to you about this, I'll come talk to you. But I think as adults, as kids, for us to have a little bit more permission to be able to say to people, um, that's not helpful to me. That would be a good thing.
Being able to set limits for yourself is a skill that would serve kids well through their life.
Yeah. I see your chat there, Kate. I didn't think she would have any trouble with agency. So to pivot just a little bit, one of the questions that I did get um, was about sort of a child had experienced sort of a peripheral loss, and it then caused a lot of anxiety for this child that that his parents were going to die. And just like, you know, because all of the sudden now their world contained like the possibility of death. And so a parent was asking me about how do they talk to them when inevitably more death occurs that doesn't freak their kid out even more. Um, and I didn't have a great answer for that other than, you know, it sounds like maybe, you know, this is what I always do, which is it really sounds like you need to go talk to a professional if your child is experiencing such extreme forms of anxiety. But I think that is hard. And Harrison, I don't know if you have anything to add to that or to share about that.
Well, sometimes I don't know the particulars of of, that situation, but a lot of times kids are reading, or not reading, but they feel the anxiety in the family. And, if parents are struggling themselves with a death in a family, the kids are going to be more anxious. And that question may have come out of that anxiety, about, am I going to be okay? Are things going to be okay? And I think it's important to reassure kids. I mean, I wouldn't necessarily say, well, I'm never going to die. I don't think that would be a good thing to say, but I think you could definitely reassure them that things are going to be okay. You are going to be okay. And because I think that's what they're responding to is their own anxiety and how it's being triggered by those around them. Because as I was saying earlier, grief is a family affair. It is very much affecting everybody.
So Harrison, I'm hearing unfortunately that as adults, we should be dealing well with our own grief. In order to be helpful to our children in dealing with
Most
their,
important thing.
that feels unfair.
Taking care of ourselves, making sure we are working through our own grief process. Yep. Accessing the support that's available to us through our church is that's maybe the best thing a church can do, is to be there for people.
How do we know when we're in too deep? How do we know when we need help? How do we know, what should we be looking for? What should we be looking for in our kids?
Well, I guess starting with the concrete kinds of things like sleeping and eating, the fundamental kind of functions of living, whether or not we're able to concentrate on the things we need to concentrate on, how reactive we are to things that are going on around us, whether or not our moods are either volatile or so low that it's hard to get out of bed. Just monitoring our own physiology almost. And if those things are starting to, our capacity to function in the world, if those things are starting to slip, then we need to get help for ourselves. Obviously, other things like substance use, alcohol, or behavioral addictions, process addictions like that. I mean, those are kind of further down the road in terms of problematic behavior that just make everything worse. But, those are always ways to cope with emotional pain. And then people that start to get involved in addictive behavior are sometimes the last to recognize it or acknowledge it. But obviously those are things to be paying attention to.
Are there red flags for children that maybe wouldn't appear for adults? I'm trying to think, like, as an adult, it's easier for me to hopefully would be easier for me to say, oh, I didn't sleep well last night, or, kids can seem so resilient sometimes that it feels like a lot of their, these things that might be out of the ordinary can be harder to pick up on, especially since they don't have as robust way of articulating sort of how they're feeling internally.
Yeah, I think a lot of it does, though, come back to self-regulation, whether they can regulate their behavior or their emotions, regressive behaviors, like their bodily functions, the bedwetting or things like that, you can see. And then, of course, if they're in school, that's one of the things that, of course, has been hard about this past year, is that one of those important sources of feedback come from the school. And if kids aren't going to school, you're not hearing from somebody, some third party, somebody who can be more objective about how your child is functioning. It does make it harder. But I would look for those kind of fundamental forms of self-regulation.
Okay.
Fighting with their siblings, more. Inability to regulate their emotions and behavior.
Yeah. Todd, Lee, Susan, anything, coming out for you, or questions you might have?
Johnny come lately here tonight, so sorry about that.
Okay.
Well, Harrison, I would just might want to ask a question of you, and in terms of in some cases things don't get better.
Mm-hmm.
And I was actually thinking about the blitz that took place in London, and how parents might have reacted or encouraged their children. I mean, in some ways, the pandemic is a blitz for us too. It's taken out a lot of the things that we don't have control over, or we didn't for a period of time. And I think I think that there might be some value also in learning from these experiences, that it's part of the whole circle of life, that loss is normal, and that we learn from that, and we grow from that, and we recognize the need for each other in that, that we're still together, we're still here together. I don't know if I'm making any sense, but
Well, yeah, I mean, you've heard of the 5 stages of grief that Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, you may have heard of those. But there's a guy now who writes a lot about grief, David Kessler, who has written some really good stuff about grief. And he talks about a 6th stage of grief called meaning making. And that's, I think, what you're referring to, Todd, is what is the meaning you make of this loss in your own life? And how are you going to grow from that loss and use that loss to create meaning in your own life, and I guess I would say hopefully use that to help others, with their own losses, because loss is something that is so universal. So that 6th stage of grief, I think, is a great concept. I think it's very important for people to find meaning in their losses.
I heard this great quote. Actually, it was on Kate Bowler's podcast, and it was Beth Moore, of all people, who I generally wouldn't turn to. But she had this great thing where she said, a lot of times people talk about pain, and that, sort of in the same way of, all part of God's plan, or everything happens for a reason, that like your pain has to serve a purpose, or like, that it's there to give you something. And she had said, sometimes like there's just pain.
Mm-hmm.
There just is. And, sometimes after the fact, you can learn something from it, but your pain doesn't have to have a meaning or a purpose behind it for it to matter.
Yeah, that's a good point, Katie.
Yeah, that it's enough that you feel pain and that your pain matters. And it was so powerful for me that it didn't have to serve a purpose, but it still mattered.
Mm-hmm. When you were talking, Todd, I was thinking about in my own family, my father had a brother who died in the war, and the family, his parents, never talked about that brother, and that family did not cope well with that brother's death. They had his uniforms in the attic. My grandmother had his medals at her bedside table. And so his presence was there, but I never heard them, or my father for that matter, talk about that person. He died before I was born. And so I never got to know who he was. And so this notion of talking about the people who we have lost is just so important. When you don't talk about that person, it's kind of like you lose them a second time. And so it's really, that's one of the things that from my own experience I've learned is critical, is not only does grief heal when it's shared, but that involves talking about the person, who they were and what they meant and what their life was like. And I don't know if the English did that. The English are not people known for processing emotional experience with language. But it's important.
Writers that talk about it.
Yeah.
I think that's a really interesting, or it's a really important thing that you bring up, though, because I think a lot of times we want to avoid talking about the person who died because we're afraid we're going to make someone feel sad.
Yeah.
And, I think that, again, with that permission, right, like to be able to go to someone and say, if they're talking about it, certainly you can talk about it. But, if you think something's going on, to say, would you like to talk about, I'll do this. Hey, do you want to talk about your dad? Is that ever anything you want to talk about? And ask those questions, because almost always the answer is yes. People do want to talk about the people who have died in their life.
Or just finding, looking for everyday opportunities, oh, your dad really loved doing that.
Yeah.
And certainly having pictures of people around the house is important to give people an opportunity to talk about them. Or that made me think of such and such a time, those kinds of things. Or it's really good if people can do that.
Yeah. My mom died when I was in college. And so, we talk about her a lot. I have teddy bears made out of her t-shirts, things like that. So she's very present. And my son Crawford, who's 6, one of his most favorite things to do is to ask me how Grandma Christine felt the day that he was born.
Oh, wow. That's a good question.
I say, well, let's imagine, what do you think Grandma Christine felt? And he would say, well, he'll always say, I think she loved me the most. And I say, well, I'm pretty sure Grandma Christine loved everyone the same. But, we talk about, that, in our house, we use the language of heaven, right? Like she was watching from heaven, that she's so present with us, just in this really different way. And, so we still talk about her like she's right here. And then he'll sometimes ask questions, like, do you think that Grandma Christine was sad that she never got to meet me? I was like, yeah, man, I bet she's so sad about that.
Mhm.
So cool, and to be able to say, like, to do that imagination play, at least with my kids, has been really important in helping them to figure out,
Mhm.
what does it mean when someone is dead? What does it not mean when someone is dead?
That's great. He asks
But I
things
found
like that.
one of the things that when you talk about that, imagining things and all of that, one of the things I think about that's been really a phenomenal thing about Facebook, of all things, is that I am actually a Facebook friends with one of my mother's friends from like the 50s.
Hmm.
Okay, so she's like 90 years old, and she is just darn cool. And then I guess I guess it would be maybe a second cousin, perhaps, whom I've never met. And yet it's been really interesting because through Facebook, we've been able to like share memories. And in fact, the person who was my mom's old friend found she had a little ceramic thing that my parents had given she and her husband, like in about 1960, and she sent that to me. So I now have this memento with my parents, and then with the other kind of the second cousin, it's been kind of interesting because we'll just share things, and she'll talk about, because she knew my grandmother very, very well, and so sometimes we can talk about Grandma Edna and all of that, and that's not a grief thing, but it's a really lovely thing, to be able to handle loss with people, even though I haven't met physically, that I have some connections with people who've gone on before.
A positive Facebook story.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, we are closing in on our hour mark here. Are there any last questions or thoughts or comments that anyone would like to share?
Well, thank you for doing this. I've learned some things, and I think it's helpful and very nice of you to do it. If you have any, 1 or 2 minutes to say, we talked about things that markers that are going wrong, how do you know if children or even adults are doing as well as they can under the circumstances? Do you have any comment on that?
Well, I mean, I think that, I guess I would maybe look at their ability to have goals and move towards them. I mean, that's a broad kind of way of thinking about it, but ultimately that's what I would kind of hope for, but also their ability to connect with people, you know, with friends or other adults, kind of social connections, their social emotional ability with people would be the two things that I would focus on probably.
Oh, wow. That's really helpful to me, Harrison, this idea of, you know, when I think about like goal setting, right? It's to be able to imagine yourself in the future, right?
That's right.
Imagine yourself forward.
It's a
And
future orientation. Exactly.
there's so much about grief that either wants to hold us in the past or to hold us right in the presence of that pain.
Yeah.
I'm going to be sitting with that one.
Okay.
Yeah. Well, I thank you all so much. There was really wonderful sharing that we had tonight. There was really wonderful learning that we had tonight. You know, grief, death, dying, it's all unavoidable and it's messy. But I'm hearing too a lot of beauty in if we tend to our grief, that we're really tending to each other, and that ability for connection and for love are really, that grief can be a birthplace for those things, and that makes it feel not so scary or isolating, maybe. Yeah.
Yeah. Not so alone.
Well, a big thank you to Harrison for his expertise and his knowledge and his wisdom. A big debt of gratitude to all of you for joining us tonight. And I'm sure that there will be more opportunities for us to have some of these larger conversations as we try and navigate life and death and everything in between.
Well, thank you for organizing it, Katie.
All right, everyone, have a really good night. Thank you so much.
Good
Thank
night,
you.
everybody.
Bye.